morning, everyone. Welcome to AC Front Page, the Atlantic Council's premier platform for world leaders tackling today's greatest challenges. I'm Risa Dixon, and I'm a co-chair of the Atlantic Council's Black Employee Network. Welcome to Atlantic Council's inaugural Black History Month celebration, Black Trailblazers in Foreign Policy. We are excited to have you all join us, both here in our studios and virtually, for this historic event. For today's AC Front Page, we are delighted to welcome Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley and Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Both women embody remarkable symbols of empowerment and resilience during their respective careers in foreign policy. As we reflect on Black History Month and its significance in a global context, we hope these lessons move and inspire policy to focus more intentionally on its goals of diversity, inclusivity, and equality. If you would like to submit a question for either of our speakers, please scan the QR code in the room or click the link in the Zoom chat. The moderator will ask questions later in the show. We hope you enjoy the discussions to come, and without further ado, I will pass it on to our very own Africa Center Senior Director, Ambassador Rama Yad, to moderate our first discussion with Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the State Department.
Risa is the Atlantic Council's Black Employee Network. Thank you, Risa, for having organized for months and launching today this wonderful Black History Month. Thank you for the BAN's unique dedication to address social justice and racial equality inside and outside these walls. Your work reflects the core mission of the Atlantic Council, shaping the future together. Before Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, I have the incredible honor today to welcome and interview Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the U.S. Department of State. Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, Shaping the Future Together could be your call as well. On April 12, 2021, when Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced your appointment as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, the first in the department's history. The first thing that struck me was your profile. In our non-US countries, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, the positions are always occupied by low-profile figures. You are a 30-year diplomat, the first woman to lead a diplomatic mission in Saudi Arabia, right? And the longest-serving US ambassador to Malta. You have also served in Baghdad, Jakarta, and Cairo. You have monitored elections in the Gaza Strip. You have supported gender equality in Saudi Arabia. In addition to the State Department, you have held senior positions, plural, at the Defense Department and at the National Security Council. Prior to that, you were a fellow on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Okay, I'm old.
The best is for the end, for the then ranking member, Senator Joseph Biden. So, and obviously, when he became president, he did not forget you, and he wanted to empower this new position. And Secretary of State Blinken said the State Department simply isn't as diverse and inclusive as it needs to be. Ambassador, welcome to the Atlantic Council. And speaking of diversity, my first question is, what does it mean exactly? Diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, does it include, gender, LGBT, disability, etc., women? And is it what you expected when you suggested the idea of this position? Because this idea comes from you to Deputy Secretary Sullivan.
Yeah. Thank you, and it's wonderful to be here with you. Diversity includes everything, and as you talk about that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, I believe of those four words, those four letters, we say DEIA, the most important is the I, which is inclusion. And that's how we're going to move this forward, because we do have to make clear that the purpose is not to simply put another group at the top of the pyramid. Inclusion means everyone. So I often say visible diversity is necessary but insufficient. When you have visible diversity, either gender parity, people of different races, disability, those who present sexual orientation, gender identity in a different way, those are signifiers to everyone that everyone is welcomed, everyone should expect to be valued. So we start with visible diversity, but there are many ways of being diverse that are not visible, and that includes neurodiversity, that includes background and lived experience. And I know some people laugh at that term, but it is important because when you're bringing people to the table to make decisions, particularly for all of the American people, then you want those lived experiences there to ensure that we truly are representing the values, the priorities, the interest of the American people, and that means all of us.
Oh, yeah. So today it's Black History Month, so Black people in foreign policy. So there are a lot of interesting figures in the U.S. foreign policy, from Secretary Austin to Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield. So why diversity is so important in foreign policy? After all, we could just say we need a U.S. representatives overseas, and what does it change? And is it the same in the other departments like Treasury, Agriculture, or is it something so special at the State Department that requires something special too?
Interesting. It's important everywhere, and again, representation is because it's we the people. That's the foundation of our nation. So it has to be all of the people. I love your question about what does it mean when you go overseas, and I think about my own experiences when I see people who look like me walking into the room. I think all of us, you know, that saying of you have to see it in order to be it, there is some resonance to that. And so seeing unexpected people come through, you know, people think about diplomacy. In many Western countries, you think white men, because that's who's had the job. But of course, all of us have capabilities. I have often argued, not that we are inherently better at the job, but that we are prepared, because as women, as minorities in this country, we have always started from a position of not being in power, of not being able to walk into the room and expect people to listen to us because we have simply walked into the room. We have to make friends. We have to be able to convince people to support our positions, to support our very presence. And I believe those basic qualities, frankly, make for better diplomacy. So I won't say we're better, I just say we're well prepared. I can imagine as people like Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield or the Vice President or Secretary Austin walk into rooms around the world, it should be a firm, gratifying reminder that America is a very diverse place, and each of us come with amazing capabilities. So,
yeah, you're right. I could add, you don't need to go or to travel overseas to live that. Very recently, I visited an embassy, not American embassy in Washington. And I was there with Alexandra, my program assistant here, who is white, etc. Yeah. And the people who welcomed us thought he was the ambassador, and I'm much older than him, and I was his assistant, and which means that I heard the joke about the Foreign Service, like Pale, Male, and Yale. Yeah. I don't know if Alexander comes from Yale, but is it true? Is there something right about this joke?
There used to be something right about that joke, yes. And they chose Yale over Harvard because it rhymes. What can I say? But we come from many different schools, and one of the things that my office has worked on that we'll be unveiling in the next few months is a broader range of options to self-identify. We want to know who we are, and we're certainly intent in ensuring that there are not demographic reasons that prevent you from reaching your full potential. But we do want to know not only the basic things that we ask of race and gender and disability, but if you come from a small town in the United States, or you have heritage from another country, not necessarily that you're a first-generation American. What is your sexual orientation, gender identity? So we're asking all of those questions so that we can ensure that we truly are welcoming to every American citizen.
Your mission is tremendously challenging and difficult, and also exciting. You have been in this position for, I think, 1 year and a half, almost 2 years.
Yeah.
Do you already have outcomes? Would you have the kindness maybe to describe the changes in recruiting and retention for underrepresented communities in the State Department and broadly in the foreign policy community?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I joke sort of about is that I have, if you saw the picture, I have white hair now that I didn't have when I started the job. So there's that, and I'm owning every strand. We started from a very strong position, and the Secretary of State ensured that. I will never be able to thank him enough, because many of my colleagues do not start with the profile, the access, the power, the budget, the personnel to get things done. And so he set us up right. I negotiated some of it, but he set us up right. So with a budget, we started with 12 staff. We have more now because people understand that we are enterprise-wide impact and want to be a part of it, and that's deeply gratifying. I would say we had to start with getting the data, and the Department of State, many agencies, many nations, your own, in fact, don't always ask the questions that will turn up the bad news. So we set out to get the demographic baseline so that we would know where we are, who we are, and where we had to go. So we've done that. We asked the questions. We got the information. We have shared it with the workforce. We shared it with Congress. We're sharing it with the American people. We share it because we want people to hold us accountable. We're not hiding from the bad information. We did a survey, a DEIA survey, to find out from our workforce where they see the problems are, where they see stumbling blocks, where they lack confidence in the systems of our organization. It was not good news, in all honesty, and we are sharing that as well because we asked questions that we would be able to act on. One of the things that we learned from our survey was that our workforce, notices the extreme lack of diversity in our senior positions, whether it is parity, gender parity, or diversity, and that the process of getting to some of these senior positions is very opaque. In fact, we're an old organization, one where relationships are very important, where if you were looking for particular positions, it was important who knew you, who was going to ask you to join their office, who was going to give you that opportunity. And so we have put in place how we hire people, that it's a diverse panel, not just a single person making the decision, that we are telling our leaders, make sure that you're giving career-enhancing opportunities, not just to the people who remind you of yourself, wonderful though you may be, but people who don't remind you of yourself, who may bring something different to the table. Make sure they have the opportunity to be acting when you're gone, to take on special projects so they're going to help them move up the ladder. And as we choose these senior positions, make sure it's not just a tap on the shoulder that gets you the job, but that they are advertised and people can compete for them. And we made this change this last year. So this is in black and white, it's in our manual. The Secretary said we're not, doing backdoor smoke group filled room deals anymore. Transparency and accountability for how we do it. I believe probably the most important thing that I will leave behind will be the change in how we judge our workforce as being ready for leadership, as being ready for promotion. And that is that each and every one of us now has the responsibility, the requirement, whether you are foreign service or civil service, as a supervisor in the civil service, to support diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And not only do you get to write, oh, I support DEIA, and move on to the next thing, but you must show the impact of your work. Did you join a DEIA council? Great, it's good that you joined. What did you do? Did you help make your workplace more accessible to your employees? Did you help integrate employees who are not in the majority population? How are you working with our locally engaged staff? Because DEIA means something different in each country around the world, and our largest cohort of employees are our locally engaged staff. So we are looking after our locally engaged staff as well as our American staff, foreign service, civil service, specialists, generalists, eligible family members, everybody. And we're doing this at missions, which means every other government agency in that mission is also part of this work.
So you track the changes, you include all the organizations related to the Foreign Service, which is a holistic approach. How, because I'm sure you mentioned that the obstacles are important to you. First, do you have allies? I mean, in the organization, in these organizations, I mean, are you supported by non-diverse people? Do you have allies, or is it a fight for minorities only?
It's a fight for everyone. Yes, I hear you on that. And that is, part of what we have to make clear in our messaging. Very definitely we have allies. Leanin.org did a survey in 2022 that points out that not only do women and minorities want to work in organizations that value DEIA, reward the work that is done by employees, mostly women and minorities, to make sure that organizations are diverse and can do better at their mission, but European American men, white men want to work in such organizations as well. So we very definitely have allies throughout our workforce, people who provide us information. Many of the great things that we're working on come from suggestions from our workforce, our strategic plan, our implementation plan. We have a 5-year plan. That was a holistic document that the entire workforce was able to feed into to help us set our priorities. But it is also a battle. I don't want to suggest otherwise. Change is hard. People don't want to change, not because they think what we have is great, but because they can't be bothered. They've got to learn something new. They don't want to. They get this system. It may not be perfect, but they know how to navigate this system. And if you are introducing change, they may not navigate it as well or as easily. So there's that level of resistance. There is the level of resistance for whom this current system is working. It's working for some folks. And they are not interested in change. Then they're just conservative people who just aren't paying attention. So you've got all of those bodies that you've got to navigate, you've got to convince. I like to tell people there's a business case for DEIA. We've heard about it from McKinsey, from Harvard, Cornell. Many organizations have done studies. Diverse boards, diverse leaderships make for better decision making, especially when you have women. Make more money if you're a private company, great, so you can make more money. But it's clear, because we've known that for years, that there are folks out there who say, I've got enough money, don't need to make more. Don't want women, don't want brown people, don't want people with disabilities, don't want to deal. So that's a business case, but it's been out there and it hasn't been as convincing as I believe it should have been. And there's a moral case. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We all want a fair system. We all want to believe we've got a fair shot. And if I want a fair shot, I have to recognize you want a fair shot. There's a moral case for it. Both of those things are out there. I don't care. I want you to think about DEIA the way we now think about cybersecurity. We may not love it, but we do it. So I don't mind what's in your heart, what's in your head. It's what you do, how you act. And the training, awareness of these issues is important, but we want to give you concrete tools. So you know, if you're in a room and you hear people talking over the women, if you hear people that a minority or a woman or a white man who's an introvert and quiet puts an idea out there and nobody heard it, and then a more assertive person puts an idea out there, usually male, and suddenly everybody's like, oh, that's a great idea. You know you should be speaking up and saying, great idea, but I heard Alice say it earlier. You must be an ally. And we are training people also to be allies because it's good for all of us.
And speaking of allies, are you still supported by the political leaders. I mean, Secretary Blinken, President Biden. Do you report to them? Do you feel? Do you have the means of your policy? I mean, because all this work you are doing requires, I guess, resources to recruit, to train teams, maybe investigator. I don't know, but that requires a lot of mobilization of resources.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah. Yes, so we've got a good budget. It has grown since I started, I'm pleased to say. I would always take much more.
Good advice for us. Thank you.
Because there's a lot of work to do. We have a diversity@state.gov web email address, and people send us in suggestions and requests for barrier analysis. We need you to look at this. We think there's a problem here. Why don't we do that? On whether it's diversity, accessibility issues, all of these are on our shoulders, but we work with partners around the building. My office doesn't do training. Our Foreign Service Institute does that. But what is the DEIA training? How can we help them? And so we're in very close contact with them and making sure they understand that we believe a very robust allyship training needs to be put in place, and they're working on that. So we work with partners around the building. But my access to the secretary is regular and good, and we start our meetings, and he's usually like, okay, what have you done? What have you accomplished? So when I go in to see him, I always know I've got to come in with what I have been able to accomplish, to lead with the partners throughout the building since the last time we met. But we have regular meetings. He's not missed a single one of them, and we do a lot of events together. This last week, we were at the Thursday Luncheon Group, the largest employee organization, the oldest in the Department of State for African American officers, and it was an amazing event, something that was in place when I was a baby diplomat, so it was really great to see it at 50. Yeah.
I understand you recently visited Africa,
Yes.
the African continent.
Yes.
And I'm a senior director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, and I'm curious about the front of the U.S. Foreign policy. How do you feel with an African American representation in the U.S. diplomacy when it comes to Africa? Because the African continent occupies a specific role in your U.S. history. So this community here working in the U.S. foreign policy, for the U.S. foreign policy, how are they welcomed in Africa? Is it an asset? Is it something you would like to encourage? And what are your expectations from the African governments, for example, when it comes to this kind of community dealing with them in Africa?
So I had a great time, and we'll be going back soon. I visited Ghana and Angola, were the two countries that I was in. Although I have been to the continent for short periods before as well. I don't know, there might be some shorthand, that's what I call it, shorthand. But some of that's based on assumptions, and it's not always accurate when you see someone who looks like you. So you might do some shorthand. But then if I were to say that sending someone of African heritage to Africa might be an asset, I don't know that it is. I certainly heard from colleagues who have served on the continent who say that they might be discounted because the expectation is for a white man and they're not, and so they've got to do some splaining on that. I also might have to say, if I said it was an asset to be black in Africa, is it an asset to be white in Europe? Well, I've served in Europe and I served very well, so I'm going to tell you no. It depends on what I bring to the table. My abilities, my background, my preparation is what's going to make the difference in the end. So I don't believe it's more than a quick smile and then on you go. I have found being the unusual one walking into the room often an asset, because while they're regrouping, who is she? And as they regrouped from you when they found out you were the boss, not your assistant, they were on the back foot. You were already ready and prepared and ready to have your conversation. So we all
I
use.
can guarantee Africans do the same mistake. So it's
Yeah, no, that's my point. There we go. That's why I don't know that it might be an asset, but there is that, initial connection perhaps, and then you have to build on it.
Do you feel more American when you are in Africa?
I feel more American when I'm overseas.
Everywhere.
As I
Cairo,
once said,
yeah.
here I am an African American. When I am overseas, I'm American.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So
If they want to deal with America, they deal with me. So.
That's interesting, and I think it's a part of your training. I mean, when it comes to this, to the Black foreign service people, right? Yeah. Before I think we are going to start the questions from the audience. From Africa to Paris. Paris, I would like to just a last word about France and its colorblind society. Blackness in foreign policy is not a topic. It's a taboo. It's not a debate. Impossible. So my question is, it may be philosophical, but maybe it is interesting for some people. How do you combat racism by using races in your speeches?
I read and I love, yeah. So I'm sorry I cannot give credit to whoever said it, but I thought it was just perfect because we have such fear about this word racist or racism, and people are offended to have it suggested that they could possibly be. And whoever said this, if somebody calls you a racist, that means a change of behavior is required. It's not an unchangeable state of being. It means you either need to rethink what just came out of your mouth, or rethink what you just did, or how you're thinking. And as sentient human beings, we're capable of all three things. I'm always curious about the color blindness, and I had a very dear friend for many, many years when we agreed on so much, and then we get into these really intense discussions, as we say in diplomatic, frank and yes. So shouting matches, because she kept saying she doesn't see color, and I kept asking, are you blind? You are not. Therefore, you see my color. What do you do with it? Now, you may be saying you don't make judgments on the basis of it, but there's no such thing as a colorblind society unless we're all not seeing, and we all are. So I think that's very interesting.
Fascinating. Just let me not frustrate our audience by asking you the first question I have here. The United Nations. The United Nations, the UN is trailblazing to address the needs of the Black diaspora in Africa's informal settlements. Will this work continue, and how can professors like myself, ask Dr. Angela Pachayan, get access involved to help with data collection and analysis?
Yeah, that is a great question, and yes, the work will continue. A lot of times I'm asked about the DEIA work in general and whether it's going to end with this administration. People are worried about that. What I say with confidence, of course, is no, that the work began before this administration. The DEIA unit upon which my office was built started in the prior administration. The work needs to be done. Everybody wants it. We focus through inclusion, accountability, and transparency. And there's not a single person any place in the world who doesn't want to be included, who doesn't want clarity as to how things are done, what they can do to help, and doesn't want people held accountable for doing good work or not doing the work. So those three things will keep us going. So for the work that's being done with the African diaspora, this is a new commitment. It's one we've talked about for many, many years. I work for the government, so I'm sure we meant it. But we really do mean it now. We've got people in place with colleagues. My colleague who's coming afterwards will be able to speak to this even more. But the work that's being done is absolutely going to be done hand in hand with the non-governmental sector, with universities, and the information will be made public. So just keep an eye on this spot. Ask the question again of Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield, and you'll get a more precise answer. But with confidence, absolutely it's going to continue.
Speaking of women in foreign policy, allow me this question I have here about, because when I started, I mentioned your role in Saudi Arabia and the difficult work you did on gender equality in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as the forefront of your diplomatic work. From this experience, how, if so, has the role of gender equality changed over the time within diplomatic efforts? How, today in your work, what's the topic there? Is there still a matter of discussion?
It still is, of course. Of course. Whenever power dynamics are shifting, you know, it's not smooth and it's never quick. But I am absolutely proud and confident of the commitment I know that my country has to gender parity, gender equality. There is absolutely a recognition of the importance of the role of women in economic development, in education, in peace making and peace keeping. We have an invaluable role. Many studies have shown that. We have had legislation since 2017. It was one of the things that made me really excited about our Office of Global Women's Issues for Women, Peace, and Security in recognition of the invaluable role, essential role that we play. There is funding committed to it internationally, and we are working with our partners around the world. We don't yet have the feminist foreign policy. I was in Chile not too long ago talking about DEIA, and they've recently committed to a feminist foreign policy. We probably will never call it that, but we're going to do it because our role is invaluable. So I think we will continue at the forefront because it's necessary, and we see that. We see that.
Including in these difficult countries where this matter is not so obvious,
yes,
like here in the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think about Saudi, and when I got there and the only woman leading a mission, and I remember one of my early events where I was doing a program for teaching English as a second language, and I was with, I won't name any names, but a senior official in the Ministry of Education, and we were both handing out the diplomas, and he didn't know who I was, and he also didn't know I spoke Arabic, so he's speaking to his, he's like, who is she? What is she doing here? Why is she here? And I also said to him, I'm here because I'm the United States representative. We send you our best, and I'm it. So.
Oh. Good answer. Yeah. And what is the most, or the biggest thing or accomplishment you are proud of, the most proud of, since you have been in this position? All these accomplishments, all these outcomes, what are you the most proud of?
I think it is making sure that every one of my colleagues understands that this is important for the health and well-being of our organization. I came back from the private sector to work with an amazing array of people. My colleagues in my own office come with background and dedication that just I'm in awe of on a daily basis, number one. The partnerships I find throughout the building, people able to help and forward the good work that we're doing. But that precept, that requirement for promotion and leadership to do this work is to take it off the shoulders of women and minorities. Because we do the work, we have to. And the work is for everyone. And doing the work well will make our organization deserve its most important resource. And this is for any organization, including yours. The most important resource is the people who are here. And when you feel that you're valued, that your potential can be recognized, that you have an opportunity to go as far as your ability can take you, your ability and your desire, because everybody doesn't want to be at the top, but as far as your ability and desire can take you, that is good for your organization. And that precept, that requirement to do the work, I think is the most important thing I can leave behind. Yeah.
And if we may mention the future, your next priorities, in the coming months or years. I don't know, how long is supposed to last this job?
Well, I am what we call a recall, so I'm back in the Foreign Service. Nice place to be. But I serve at the pleasure. So as long as I do a good job, I keep my job. And as long as I have the energy to do it, I keep my job. But, you know, we all have different things in our lives that we also have to take care of. I have a marriage of 40 years that I need to hold on to as well. So
you are a veteran in everything. That's crazy.
Well,
Congrats.
diplomacy helps in all things.
So we are all ears with this advice. So your next priorities for the coming months or years, what would you like to promote more? What are your important actions, coming actions?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we sent out guidance to the workforce about ways that they can help our colleagues with disabilities. And accessibility, that A part, is absolutely critical in our organization too. We are missing either in the full contributions of those who are there. We certainly can have more people with disabilities in our diplomatic corps.
The gaps are about infrastructure, or it's more?
You know, it's both. It's infrastructure. It is the ability to provide technological or human reasonable accommodations for our colleagues to do their best work. And it's also a way of thinking. And let me be perfectly honest, you know, people worry about being called racist or sexist or other things, which is not a good thing to do, but again, you can change your behavior. So I will speak to you very honestly with regard to people with disabilities. I came with a lack of knowledge and concern. Is this going to be more of a burden for me to have someone with a disability? Am I going to do the right thing? I think fear is a huge part of our keeping others away because we're afraid of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, not being good enough or strong enough or wise enough to treat and welcome as we should. So I always tell people, as I accept it myself, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. I'm focusing now on two things, resilience and grace. Resilience because there are jerks all over the world, in the Department of State and in every organization. People can be unkind and stupid. So that's resilience. You know, people can be beaten down by, oh my God, I can't believe you said that again.
Yeah, bias and prejudice.
Yes. So we need to be allies for each other as victims, as people who are perpetrating things upon us. We need our colleagues to step up in the moment so that we don't feel alone, to help our resilience. And then sometimes we just have to go to the ladies' room and pull up our pants and go back out there again. And that's the resilience part. You know, my mom used to say, don't let the so-and-sos get you down. So I don't. But we have to give that to each other. I tell people, run with the posse, support each other, listen, help. But then the other part is grace, because people will make mistakes. Sometimes they're thoughtless, sometimes on purpose, but everybody can learn, and sometimes we're just going to have to forgive, acknowledge, forgive, and move on as well. So with those two things, all of us giving it. I gave a talk on microaggressions, and I began the talk talking about my own latest microaggression, because we can all do it to each other. Nobody, you know, women can microaggress against gays, and gays can microaggress against Muslims, and Muslims can microaggress with people with disabilities. We can all do it. So no one's got any pride of place. We have to learn and give each other grace.
And do you have goals in terms of numbers in the coming to appreciate or assess your success?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, my dear.
Track numbers in every month, every year.
Logically, one would, yes.
Yeah.
So, but the law does not allow us to be logical and sensible about how we address this. The law does not. So we've got the numbers, they're out there. We have no quotas, that's against the law. We have no targets. Our lawyers don't like that word either. It's too close to quotas, guidelines, etc. So we've got the numbers. We know what our population looks like. We know what the labor force looks like. So the numbers we've put out there come next to the population numbers and the labor force numbers. So we can see that one part of the Department of State is extremely diverse on the one hand, but if you look at the top of the organization and or you look at who are in the professional positions, that diversity falls away. So we don't have numbers, but we definitely know generally where we're going, and that is to truly represent the American population.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah. I think we have reached our...
We got the hook.
Yeah, exactly. It's time to give the floor to the next speakers. But before doing that, I would like to tell you how grateful I am. We are very honored, delighted, proud to have you on this stage. For this Black History Month, we could not do better than having you. So thank you and good luck for your tough but exciting and so necessary mission.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like to turn to the CEO and President of the Atlantic Council, who, thanks to whom we can organize this kind of event. Fred Kemp.
Rama, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. And Ambassador, what a wonderful session that was. The Atlantic Council's inaugural Black History Month event on our premier global platform, the Atlantic Council front page. Black History Month marks a time of recognition and acknowledgement, certainly on the ongoing obstacles facing people of color in this country and beyond, but also the equally ongoing triumphs of people of color in this country and beyond. The Atlantic Council seeks to understand these challenges in a global context to better shape our efforts toward a future of equity and inclusion. The two women you're hearing about this morning are true trailblazers in a world of foreign policy. Ambassador Abercrombie-Winstanley has enjoyed a 30-year-long career in diplomacy. She's had several senior positions at the U.S. Department of Defense, National Security Council, and worked as a policy advisor to the commander of U.S. Cyber Forces, as well as held the position of U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Malta. She now sits as a Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the U.S. Department of State. So I want to thank the Ambassador for sharing her insights with us. For our next discussion, I'm deeply pleased to welcome Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who in previous incarnations has come often to the Atlantic Council at events of our Africa Center. She is now the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. She's one of the finest diplomats of her generation, or really any generation of diplomats. Her expertise and diplomatic skill derive from a decades-long commitment to service. Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield grew up in the segregated South and was one of the first Black women to enroll at Louisiana State University. She began her work in the Foreign Service in 1982 and held several positions across 4 continents, including Ambassador to Liberia, before serving as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And in that role, she led U.S. policy towards sub-Saharan Africa and managed the U.S. response to the Ebola crisis. She retired after a 35-year career, or at least she thought she retired, but like all people of that capability, she got called back into service, becoming the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations 2021. At the UN, she is the face and the voice of the United States to the international community at what President Biden himself has called an inflection point in history. Her recent work has focused on addressing the national security and humanitarian needs of the vulnerable populations, as exemplified by her most recent U.S. mission to Somalia. And she has been a strong ally and advocate for Ukraine, where many people think the battle for the global future of the global system is taking place on that battlefield. So it's incredibly exciting to host such an influential and outstanding woman, and then women with Ambassador Abercrombie-Winstanley on this stage at the Atlantic Council. Our hope is that these conversations bring to light narratives too often marginalized and discounted, We aim to deepen our understanding of the strides Black leaders in foreign policy have made and explore opportunities to improve upon their long-standing fight toward justice. Furthermore, we hope these perspectives allow all of you, as global citizens here in our headquarters audience and around the world, to find a path forward in our common interests of peace and prosperity. And with that, it is my great pleasure to turn the stage over, and I think this is her first time actually in our offices, but Abby can tell me if that's true, CNN anchor and senior political correspondent Abby Phillip, who will moderate the discussion. And it's great to see her relatively early on in the morning after a late night at the State of the Union where we were all watching you at CNN. So Abby, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fred, and thank you all for being here. Good morning. Thank you, Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield. We were both up late last night.
Yes, we were.
You were actually in the room for the State of the Union address. I was sitting on a cold set. But we really appreciate you getting up early to be here. And also for, as Fred said, answering the call to service, because I think for this particular discussion, your presence in this role is really what a lot of people in this room want to know a lot more about. And so we're definitely going to get into some of your life and your story and your journey in the Foreign Service. But it's a Wednesday in America, and there's a couple things I do want to talk to you about. First of all, your quick reaction to the State of the Union last night. What was it like to be in that room? It was a little wild last night, a little raucous.
I wouldn't describe it as wild. It was electrifying.
Yeah.
It really was electrifying. It was amazing listening at the president, have all of us, in his hands, listening to him share with America and share with our Congress the successes of the administration over the past 2 years, how his administration has delivered for the American people.
And of course, this is it feels like a critical time, but this is a critical time. There's a lot going on in the world. China is a part of that picture. And I want to relate this to the other part of our conversation too, but just for a moment on China. The spy balloon captured everyone's attention. Are we at a low point right now in our relationship with China?
We're certainly at a reflection point in our relationship with China. The president spoke to President Xi a few weeks ago, and they agreed that Secretary Blinken would go to have discussions, and to have this spy balloon cross into over U.S. territory right at the moment that we were in the process of trying to develop some diplomatic conversations with them just says how complicated dealing with China is. And I think the president was very clear that when our sovereignty is invaded, we will respond.
When it comes to China, I think it seems that there is a lack of attention to how China is using its influence around the globe, but particularly on the continent of Africa. Tell me about where you think the United States is, the public is, in understanding how China is seeking to gain leverage around the globe. And is that message really penetrating? And does more need to be done?
There's always more to be done, but our relations with the continent of Africa are strong. The president just hosted African leaders in December here in Washington. It was an astoundingly successful event. I traveled to the continent right after, and I heard nothing but positive views from African leaders directly on how much they appreciated that engagement. They want more.
Yeah.
They want more engagement, and we have promised to give them more engagement. My visit, Janet Yellen's visit a week earlier, sent that same message. We have other cabinet officials who are planning trips to the continent. But let me just say, this is not my first visit around the block. I have been on the African continent for 30 years. I first traveled there in 1978, and I have never looked back. Africa is a core interest for the United States and for the people of the United States. And Africa is the last frontier of possibilities. And we know that we have to engage with that continent, and we are engaging with that continent. We're not competing with China. I would say the opposite. China is trying to compete with us. They're coming from the rear. We have a strong African diaspora here in the United States. There's no way that China can compete with those kinds of engagements that we have. But we're not asking African countries to choose between the US and China. We're offering to our partners in Africa an alternative. We're offering to them a system that's based on values, that focus on people, focus on humanitarian assistance, but also focuses on human rights.
And on Ukraine, since I have you here, it seems like we are on the cusp of what could be an escalation of the conflict, but I'm wondering about peace. What do you think it would take on the ground for peace to be a real possibility, an actual diplomatic and negotiated peace being a possibility?
The answer is simple. Russia needs to pull its troops out of Ukraine. Ukraine is not attacking Russia. Russia brought its troops into Ukraine and attacked the people of Ukraine. So to move forward toward a peaceful settlement, Putin needs to pull his troops out, stop firing on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and go back to the negotiating table. But it can't happen as long as he is still inside of Ukraine acting as the aggressor.
And on food, I've been fascinated by how all of this has affected the global food supply. It's been particularly acute on the continent of Africa, but I think globally we're all feeling it. Where do you think things stand at this moment? And do you see Russia trying to use food scarcity as a tool in this war?
They've used food scarcity. They're using winter. They're using fear as a tool of this war. But Abby, I will tell you, when I went to New York in February of 21, I became president of the Security Council in March. My signature event was food insecurity. We've had an issue related to food insecurity before this war, brought on by COVID, the pandemic and supply chain issues, brought on by climate change, brought on by conflict, but exacerbated by Russia's war on Ukraine. You know, most of the countries in Africa get somewhere around 50% of the grain that they consume from Russia and from Ukraine. For that reason, we did not sanction Russian agricultural products. They can export their grain. They're exporting more grain this year than they did in previous years. So they have talked about themselves being aggrieved. They're not aggrieved, they're aggressors. And what they're doing is affecting all of us. I also addressed this issue on my recent trip to Africa, in Mozambique and Ghana, where people are feeling the pain of food shortages and high prices.
Yeah. Early on in this conflict, there was a conversation that was happening a lot in the media, but in a lot of homes too in this country, about what some people perceived as a double standard in the reaction to Ukrainian refugees, for example, in the reaction of the world to conflict in Europe. I just want to give you an opportunity to just address that question as a Black woman in this role. If you are a Black person in America and you're looking out at the world and you're saying, okay, I see conflict happening all over the place in the continent of Africa and the Middle East, and it doesn't get this reaction. Why? What's your answer to them?
I actually would disagree with that. Yeah. We are engaged in trying to address issues of conflict everywhere, all over the world. What we saw in Ukraine was an attack that it was literally on all of our values. But when we saw Ukrainian refugees moving, they were moving to the border countries. They were moving into Europe, and they were warmly welcomed into Europe. We need to duplicate that all over the world. When people feel that they have to flee and they have to cross a border to flee, they need to be warmly welcomed, and we need to encourage that. And the U.S. has been a country that we're a country of immigrants. We are a country, I was in Kenya last week, we're taking 40,000 Africans as our ceiling for the refugee program. When I started working on those issues back in 1989, we're only taking 2,000. It's an immense improvement on what we're doing. It's a work in progress. I'm not saying we're perfect, but we are continuing to try to improve how we respond to these issues everywhere in the world.
But you would agree that Europe has not always welcomed refugees from other parts of the world, Syria and elsewhere.
And that's something that we raise constantly with our colleagues, that we all have to we have to be open to people who are fleeing persecution. We have to help people find a way to survive, and it's a conversation that needs to continue.
Yeah. And also last night at the State of the Union, the family of Tyree Nichols, they were a guest of the President and the First Ladies in the balcony, and I believe they're still in Washington this morning, but moments like that, I mean, their personal tragedy has become a national tragedy, similar with George Floyd. As a diplomat, how does that affect these domestic issues around race and around our society and around policing? How does that affect, if at all, the work that you're doing around the globe?
Well, first of all, I'm impacted as a mother of a son,
Yeah.
of a Black son. And so I felt this personally. I felt the George Floyd murder personally. I felt what Tyree's mother felt because I have a son.
Yeah.
So I can talk about this from my heart. And so at the UN, I talk about it from my heart. I don't make excuses. We have to deal with these issues, but I think we can say very openly the killers of George Floyd have been arrested. The killers of Tyree have been arrested. So while this continues to happen, and we have to find a way, as the President noted, to address these issues, the United States, I think, as you compare us to other countries, we're not sweeping this under the carpet anymore. We're actually openly addressing this. And I gave a speech on race at the UN my first few months there, and talked about the fact that while we're not a perfect country, we openly admit to our weaknesses, and we work to address those weaknesses.
Yeah, I hear this, and I'm sure that you do too. But I wonder if you hear it in your private or even publicly from coming from China and Russia. They often cite the United States' record on policing, the racial strife on the ground, as evidence that our system isn't operating properly. Do you hear that?
I hear it from them, but
What do you say to them?
I mean,
what's the response? I mean, and do they say it to you in private conversations?
No, they don't say it in private conversations. Yeah. They use the moment.
Yeah.
And when they use the moment, it falls on deaf ears, because we all know that both of these countries are authoritarian and that people in their countries don't have rights. And so having them try to call the United States out just doesn't resonate.
So I do want to get a little bit to your background, because I think it's so extraordinary. But how did you first see yourself as a diplomat? What did it take for you to see yourself playing a role in the foreign policy of the United States of America?
I have so many friends in the Foreign Service who tell me they wanted to be a Foreign Service officer when they were, 5 years old or, 5th grade. I didn't even know this existed. I didn't know it existed when I was in high school. I didn't really have a clear picture of the Foreign Service even in college. But I went to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, studying Africa with the intent of being in the academy, and ended up taking a trip to Africa, to Liberia, in 1978. And it really changed my life because I suddenly realized that there are these embassies overseas and they're really making, they're representing America, they're representing the people of the United States. And so that's when I first thought about it in 1978, and I joined the Foreign Service in 1982.
I imagine that a lot of diplomats of color, particularly Black diplomats, might worry about being pigeonholed. Did you ever worry about that?
What I worried about is that people thought I was being pigeonholed because I was studying Africa.
Yeah.
And that's where I wanted to be. But I also know that our system did historically pigeonhole African Americans to Africa and occasionally to the Caribbean, but other people wanted the Caribbean because it was on nice beaches. But we were kind of pigeonholed to Africa. And so there I was, an Africanist, loving to work on the continent and having to kind of justify the fact that I actually wanted to stay in Africa and not go anywhere else. And I think we've come to change that now. We have an African American ambassador in I'm about to forget it, in Qatar, and so we're changing. But for me, it was not about being pigeonholed. It was about where my passions were and where my professional experience was.
I am curious about when you look at the broad scope of U.S. foreign policy, not just over the last couple of years, but over decades, it does seem to me that there is often this ebb and flow in interest in Africa. But correct me if I'm wrong, if you don't think that that is a fair assumption. Do you think that that is what has happened in U.S. foreign policy? And at what point, what will it take to kind of even that out so that there's consistency over time in the view of Africa from a strategic perspective in relationship to the United States?
I think you're right. There has been this ebb and flow. And it's not based on administrations, although the previous administration ignored Africa. But when you look back at the Bush administration, he devoted so many initiatives to the African continent. You had the malaria initiative, you had PEPFAR, you had MCC. There were so many initiatives that came out of the Bush administration where Africa was really kind of the tip of the sword for our foreign policy. So yes, you're right. There have been these ebbs and flows. We're on a flow now, and we have to keep flowing to make sure that we don't ignore this continent. 54 countries, over 1 billion people, the median age of 19, so it's a youthful population, and it has enormous resources. So yeah, that's why China is trying to enter this market. Theirs is very transactional. Ours is more related to our values.
You mentioned the previous administration ignored the continent. The Trump administration, what was the consequence of that?
I think what we saw happen on the African continent, but also at the United Nations, like any place where you leave open space, the Chinese fill that space. They actually up their game on the continent of Africa, and they up their game in the United Nations. So at the moment, we're trying to move back, and I think we've succeeded, to our place of leadership, in both places.
Yeah, I'm curious, just because you mentioned you brought China up one more time. I'm curious about the spying element of this beyond the United States. Obviously, all countries spy, but are there limits? I mean, in terms of territorial integrity, that China should be mindful of as they, float. I mean, it sounds like these balloons are perhaps floating all around the globe at this point.
Well, I think other countries ought to also mind their borders and look at what is happening in their country. If the Chinese can boldly enter U.S. airspace, what's happening to other countries that don't have the capacity to respond as we have responded? And I think for all intents and purposes, everybody ought to be on guard.
Does that break any international
Of course.
law? Yeah.
Of course. Your territorial integrity is this is what we're seeing with Ukraine and Russia. Russia crossed into Ukraine. They actually broke through Ukraine's borders. You don't, without an invitation, cross into another country's borders.
Yeah. I want to talk about the Foreign Service, because I know that there's actually a question in here from someone in the audience about that. So I'll fold this question into what I was going to ask her about. I don't have a name here, unfortunately, but it says, please describe the changes in recruiting and retention for underrepresented communities at the State Department and in the broader foreign policy community. And obviously, there has long been a concern at the Foreign Service. What is it? The male pale and Yale is the terminology. I think that's probably true in a lot of places, not just the Foreign Service.
I was about to say that.
To be fair. But that was exacerbated, it seems, based on the numbers, actually, in the Trump administration. Do you see that changing?
Well, it was changing before the Trump administration, and the Trump administration couldn't change some of the programs that we had already put in place. We have 3 scholarship programs that focuses on bringing in diversity into the Foreign Service. The Pickering Fellowship Program, the Rangel Fellowship Program, Payne Fellowship for people going into USAID. Also, we have put diplomats in residence. These are Foreign Service officers like myself who take a year, 2 years off and go on an assignment to a university. We've always had a dip in residence, for example, in Atlanta, working with the HBCUs there. We do a lot of recruiting. I was head of the Foreign Service, and my recruitment always focused on making sure that we're inclusive. And it's not just recruiting at HBCUs, it's recruiting in high school. It's going to high schools so that young people like me living in the South can meet people like me now.
Because you don't know what you
don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
So I always said to people, I was a young person without ambition because I didn't know what ambition was. I saw 2 possibilities. I could be a teacher or a lawyer. So I decided I was going to be a lawyer. It never occurred to me I could be a diplomat. You try to be what you see. And I saw one lawyer and I saw a lot of black teachers. So that was what I wanted to do. We need to get out more. And I always say to our diplomats, when you go home, go and speak at a high school. Go and speak at your alma mater. African Americans, we have a role to play as well in ensuring that we encourage people like us to come into the Foreign Service. But we also need the system to support that, and I think we have that support. Gina, who was just here, her position is an extraordinary first ever position in the State Department that will focus on these issues. Retention is also an issue. So while we were relatively successful on the recruiting side, we have to work to retain people. They need to have mentors. They need to have mentors who look like me, but they also need their white colleagues to mentor as well so that they can succeed in what is an extraordinarily complicated, challenging career.
Yeah. Retention is such a big part of this picture. And I wonder, as you look back on your career, because I think we all have had these moments, did you have, I'm sure you did, moments where you thought, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And what kept you in it?
So people who know me have heard this story. My first year in the Foreign Service, my husband and I got pregnant unexpectedly. And I was on my first tour in the Foreign Service, and he was in the Foreign Service and based here in Washington. I was assigned to Jamaica. And I asked a simple request, leave without pay so I could come home to have my baby. The State Department did not at that time allow leave without pay for entry-level officers. And they basically said, sorry, we don't give leave without pay to entry-level officers. I'm like, at some point I gotta have this baby. And I have no leave, and I'm not a leave abuser, I just started.
Right.
So I needed leave without pay, and the system just did not respond. And so I finally was bold enough to ask for an appointment to see the Director General of the Foreign Service. And she agreed to see me. And she had her talking points, which were, we don't give leave without pay to entry-level officers. And she gave me leave without pay. But I was very, very close to leaving the Foreign Service. And so when I became Director General of the Foreign Service, if there was one thing my staff could depend on me, if someone came to me with leave without pay requests because of family issues, it didn't matter what the system said, I approved it. And I know 2 people that I approved that for who've gone far in the Foreign Service, and every time I see them on promotion lists and I see them in person, I'm so proud because I know that I played a small part in making sure that their trajectory in the Foreign Service was one for success, that we supported them. But I came very, very close to quitting at that point.
Yeah, I mean, and that is so critical. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I know there are probably some mothers in this room and watching at home, but that is so critical for women in any line of work, but it's one of those silent, quiet challenges that your male colleagues may not ever have. When you need to take leave without pay to have a child, and the system doesn't allow it.
Yeah.
I wonder, as a Black woman as well, and as someone who ran the Foreign Service, what do you see as the choke points for people of color advancing in the way that the system is set up?
You know, it's when you get at the top of the mid-levels, it's crossing that threshold into the senior foreign service. And in order to cross that threshold, you have to have certain types of positions, certain types of jobs. You have to be a deputy chief of mission, for example. You have to be head of a section. You have to be director of an office. And I spent 30 years in the Foreign Service, and I've never been a deputy chief of mission. I never made it. I would always make the list. The lists were important because they would create this list, and the list had to be diverse. So I provided them their diversity. I was a woman, I was Black, but I didn't have to be selected. I just had to be on the list. And so I was fortunate that I just crossed over that bridge without having to, I basically swam under the bridge, to be honest.
How? Okay, well, tell us how. I mean, that's really fascinating. I think people can really learn from that.
I decided I was going to be good at what I was doing. I was not going to be held back because somebody didn't think I was worthy of being their deputy. So I actually bypassed it by being, I became on the humanitarian and refugee side, I became a known person. People wanted me on their team. And at some point, I got a call saying, can you come to the Africa Bureau to be a deputy assistant secretary? Never having served as a DCM, never having served as an office director, never having served as a DCM.
Do you think that those benchmarks serve a good purpose?
I do think they serve a good purpose, and I think we have to make sure that the system doesn't stand in the way of people getting that experience. Because when I became an ambassador, I had an amazing deputy chief of mission who I selected. And I realized as I watched what she did to serve me, that that would have been helpful to me in my role as an ambassador.
You mentioned a couple of programs, including the Rangel Fellowship and others. Those programs are really necessary, but I was reading a little bit about this, and some of the complaints from Black members of the Foreign Service is that those programs are looked at, people who come through those programs are looked at differently. Do you hear that, and what can be done about that?
I did hear that early on, and when I was Director General of the Foreign Service, I would go to visit a post, and I'd ask to meet with the Pickerings or the Rangels, and then I'd hear, well, they don't really want to be highlighted like that, so you need to meet with everyone. And I got that message. They wanted to be, part of the whole. But I think we have gotten past that now because our Foreign Service has accepted, and they know that the people who are accepted into the Rangel and Pickering program are the best and the brightest from wherever they come. They are competitive. They're as competitive as any of our colleagues, and they are prepared for success. And again, I'll go back to our ambassador in Qatar. He was a Pickering Fellow.
We started off by talking about you answering the call, probably literally, from President Biden to come back into service. Why did you do it? What did you want to accomplish?
As I sat on the sidelines, watching our diminishing role, our diminishing leadership, I felt we all had a responsibility to do whatever we could to help. And while I was perfectly content in my semi-retirement, I also felt an obligation, a duty to respond to that call, and I've not regretted it.
One of the things that you've been working on is reforming the UN Security Council. What's the objective there?
The UN and the Security Council in particular was created over 70 years ago.
Yeah.
The world was different. It was created out of war. The 5 permanent members were part of that system and had a vested interest in creating a system that would prevent these countries from going to war again. We now have 193 countries in the UN system. When the UN was created, there were only 2 independent African countries, Ethiopia and Liberia. Now we have 50 plus independent African countries. So we think the UN, the Security Council, needs to be fit for purpose. It needs to be more inclusive. It needs to take into account the changes that we've all seen happening in the world. And we have decided that we want to lead in that process. The president announced that during his speech at High Level Week last September, and I've been engaging in consultations in New York with a broad range of countries to talk about how they see Security Council reform, how they see UN reform broadly, and we hope to continue this discussion to bring that to some kind of end result that leads to a much more inclusive United Nations Security Council.
And of course, this is happening at a moment for the world in which you could argue Russia is trying to break the system.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it seems clear that the system at 70 years old is aging, it's straining against the realities of what the globe looks like right now. Are we going to get to a point, and when I say we, I mean the world, where there needs to be a real comprehensive look at the system of global peace and security that has held up pretty well, but is clearly under attack?
Yeah, no, and that's what we're doing. That's exactly what we're doing. And we're not just doing it here in New York. We're also, the president announced that the African Union should be part of the G20. We're doing it in other organizations as well. So at 70, the system is creaky. I'm 70, I'm creaky. I had a problem standing up and down last night. So it's a creaky system, and it needs some fixing.
I want to just thank you one more time for this extraordinary talk. Before we go, though, I want to ask you just to reflect on your own life and your own story. And if you were to talk to your 18-year-old self, who maybe thought she was going to be a teacher or a lawyer, nothing wrong with teachers and lawyers.
Nope.
Of course, my dad was a teacher for many years. What would you say to her?
I would say to her what I have been repeating to young people, a quote that I heard from President Sirleaf, and she hears me say it all the time. She gave a speech at Harvard some years ago, and she said, dream big. And if your dreams aren't big enough to scare you, they're not big enough. And that's what I wished I had known when I was 18. I didn't dream big. I realize now, looking back, I probably did dream bigger than I might have otherwise, but I didn't see myself. I didn't see myself in this role, certainly. I didn't see myself in the Foreign Service. I didn't see myself as a successful mom and grandmother. I just didn't have the foresight.
Yeah.
I didn't dream big, and that's what I would say, dream big.
Can you give us one parting message? I always like to give a moment for the working moms, which I'm one. How is it being a mom in the Foreign Service?
You know, it was tough. My kids are adults now, and they sometimes tell me how tough it was for them because I was moving them around every 2 or 3 years. They weren't really established in any single place. And what I would say to mothers, something I deal with, you're not going to be a perfect mom. You just got to keep trying. And you need to talk to your children and listen, not just talk to them, but listen to your children, but also listen to yourself. So my kids never really appreciated that I made sacrifices for them because they only dealt with the bad part. But I always felt I made sacrifices. I made sacrifices in terms of what jobs I took because I would only take a post where there was a school. I never thought about sending my kids to boarding school, and particularly when they were young. I didn't take amazing vacations, although we did take a few, but I always wanted them to come home so that they had a perch. So I'm from Louisiana. My kids went to Louisiana every single summer, and I was shocked to hear my 30-plus-year-old son say, I'm from Louisiana, because he never grew up there. So I feel like I'm successful. I was successful in giving them a bit of a perch, making sure that they had family, making sure, for example, we sat at the dinner table together every single night. Parents don't do that. We're always on the run. You're giving kids food out of a microwave. My kids will always say, I always cooked for them, even I cook now. They always had a home-cooked meal. My daughter was with a friend, and they were making boxed macaroni and cheese and our hamburger helper or something like that. And my daughter said, oh, God, my mom would never feed us that. So
I'm not going to say anything about the box.
Attention.
I'm not going to comment on that. No, I'm not going to comment on that.
So pay attention to your kids and find those moments that are meaningful with them. I've decided with my grandchildren, my son told me I couldn't give them any more presents, so I'm giving them experiences.
Yes.
And
yes.
that's what you should do with your children.
Yes, I support that as a mother of an 18-month-old. Too many things,
Yeah.
not enough experiences.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. On this, your second tour of duty in public service. It's a busy time for the world. It's great to have you here the morning after the State of the Union. Just, it's always consequential, but particularly at this moment. Thank you, Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield,
Thank
for
you
this
so
great
much.
conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Good.